All right. How's everyone? Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Welcome.
Yes,
So,
good.
you made it through. Did you? No. I thought it would be a challenge.
That's quite a challenge. Yeah,
It's not like a novel, though. You don't have to finish it.
Right. Well, you don't have to.
It's just
Well, the ending,
The acting was right. It's where everything came together.
Yeah, I didn't get to
That's-
that. I got to like 70%. And, I know it. Still need to read the important.
All right.
started too late.
Not bad. Not bad. Well,
I
you know,
wasn't-
you know why I wanted to read this book.
But just this one.
We know we don't know, but
Yeah.
we want to know.
Okay, well that's good. That's what I was hoping for. That's what I was hoping for. Well, I tell you what, before we actually talk about the, the premise again of the book club, hopefully, is that we want to look at secular books from a Torah perspective. But before we actually start to discuss, how we might look at this from a framework of Torah, I'm just interested in, is this the first time, I assume it's the first time that you've read the book?
I haven't even seen it.
Haven't seen it yet. All
I've
right.
just seen it this
You're
minute.
just along for the ride.
Yeah.
All right, good. Kol hakavod. Thank goodness. So what I'm interested just to hear, to begin with, what did you learn? What did you learn from the book? What are some of the highlights of what you felt were impactful, interesting?
Well, his intellect, his breadth of knowledge.
He knows what he's talking about, Professor Dawkins, doesn't he? Yeah,
Absolutely stunning.
yeah,
I
absolutely.
think the title is really, it's very apt for the content of the book,
Oh,
because it's when you look in the animal kingdom alone, and you see how everything is cross-pollinated with the plants and the bees and everything. It's like a wonder of the world.
and you see how things evolved and developed around food source and around mating, right? So it's food and mating and food and mating and everything, so the brilliance I felt, of being able to see how, looking at it this way, you see the beauty of interaction. Not just the fact that it's beautifully designed for, but you see the interplay, the shared development of things. To me, it tells such a beautiful element of the unity of the world. I mean, just how integrated everything is. The first time that I saw that, it was profoundly impactful. What else? What else stood out? I mean, things that maybe we didn't know before that he brought our attention to.
I read the appendix before I started, and I just felt the whole way through he was totally frustrated by creationism.
That's an important point.
And,
Is
and
yeah.
when you read, the stats at the back about America, you've got this open
It's embarrassing
society.
for Americans, isn't it?
It is. And,
Yeah.
and funnily enough, when we've on a recent holiday, a sort of ranger talked about the frustration rocks to people who were just didn't buy into anything of this age business. So I felt that was really heavily embedded in the book.
It's so true. Is he rightfully frustrated?
Yeah, I think he's got a very valid point.
Degrades
about
the book.
statistics.
I think it
Yes.
degrades the book a little bit. I think his tone is very annoying. I think that if he weren't such an eminent person, he wouldn't get away with a lot of what's written here, a lot of the diversions, a lot of the not sticking to the point.
So not the science, but the
Yeah, the tone, not the science.
Right.
No, I find that the tone, all of his little
Nudges.
yeah,
Mm.
Yeah,
are
but
just,
I mean,
are just
he's
irritating.
a frustrated man. Religion and creationism are his two bugbears.
But that's
He
not really
had-
the way to fight it. I think the way to
Well-
fight it is to write a concise book that's factual,
Mm.
which most of this is,
Mm.
right? 90% of it is, but it's like the 10 or 20%. It's just irritating.
Well, I'd like to come back to that because I think it's an important point. You have something to add
I
on?
was just going to agree. I think it's completely gratuitous.
Mhm.
It spoils the book. It's a fundamental error.
Mm.
Because it just makes you think this is a spiteful, stupid man. In spite of his deep knowledge of biology and in particular of evolution. And so
Fascinating.
It's dreadful.
Yeah.
It-
So I mean, what it sounds like is that we acknowledge his brilliance of study and
Definitely.
his capacity. I personally, I wouldn't have suggested the book if I didn't feel that this was a readable book. I don't think it was an easy, read while you're, falling asleep book.
Yeah.
But I was impressed by his capacity to put forth the information in a pretty understandable way. I mean, it's not like you had to.
actually
come-
don't
yeah.
agree with you.
Really?
Well, maybe it's
Mm.
because it emphasised my dismal lack of scientific knowledge.
Oh,
Because I had to give up science at the age of 14 in order
Mm.
to do all sorts of other things.
Mm.
And I felt it all the way through. I felt I do not know what he's talking about. I mean, I just read you one paragraph that he starts with. He begins talking about the hairpin thought experiment.
Yes.
About how animals.
Mhm.
He talks about reasons that will become apparent, walking forwards in time, explaining how we arrive at a leopard from a rabbit. I'm confused here.
Mhm.
All we have to do is walk backwards from one species to the shared ancestor, then turn through the hairpin bend and walk forwards to the other species. We are not evolving a rabbit into a leopard. You could say we are de-evolving back to the hairpin, then evolving forwards to the leopard from
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
completely lost with
Yeah.
that
No,
kind
I
of
could hear
thing.
that. I could hear that. I could understand.
He's talking
that.
about time, I guess.
Yeah. I
It's
mean,
not very
yeah. He's
clear.
good. Right.
Yeah.
He's trying to use an analogy that, in this case, may not have worked
But
very well.
He's
yeah,
working
I agree with that. Was clumsy,
Mhm.
but it's all very. If you've had it's strange for a lot of science books.
I think
I-
that's exactly what I'm saying.
I mean, it was
but
all,
it's
it's
my
all very
fault, not
familiar
his
stuff.
fault,
Yes,
because
He
I
felt
but
that-
it's that incursion of stridency about that background that he's sort of hung up about.
Yeah.
Comes through from time to time
Yeah.
and spawns it.
Yeah.
a bit.
It's interesting. I mean,
He spoiled it, that he had to emphasise what a fact was and to explain it in detail.
But he's frustrated.
Yes.
he's
He's
frustrated.
very
I want to
frustrated.
speak for that for a minute because
Agree with that chapter
I
is
hear
great.
this. I to a certain degree can appreciate his frustration because when I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many of us at the table have had to discuss this with staunch creationists. If you've had the experience of trying to present this idea to staunch creationists, it's not a walk in the park. It's not a walk in the park. It's almost as if when you've spent your life, as he has clearly, I mean, there's no question about it. He's life that to you so clearly, so abundantly evident what the book's purpose was. It was the end of it and the processes through which it occurs, and his famous book, The Selfish Gene, which by no means you read as this, so I don't recommend it. But when you have to put that out to creationists, that God put this world together in 6 days like it is, like Legos, essentially, like a mechanic. Yeah. Yeah. It is furiously frustrating. It's furiously frustrating. I mean, it really can get the best of a person. I mean, if you read his other books, there's no question about the fact that he's not, dubbed a militant atheist for no reason. And he tries really hard. If you know his other stuff, he tries really hard in this book not to let that come through, but it clearly does. Clearly people pick up on it. But it is something to think about, because it's almost as if, I mean, you remember this dialogue that he has with this, he puts the transcript of this
Yeah.
dialogue he has with this woman who's a creationist,
Yeah.
and he says, well,
Look
why
at
don't,
them.
and he's trying his best to be on his best behavior. He's like, well, go to the museum and see it, and she just refuses to even respond. And that's the good situation. In the poorer situations, or the less fortunate situations, there are direct attacks on person, on morality of the individual, because they don't accept that God put the world together in this capacity, and so on. And so not to be his lawyer of defense, but I understand where it is that he's at in his mind in terms of putting this forward. Although perhaps, yeah, I mean, I hear that he could have certainly done a little bit of a better job. I mean, I think just reading the last paragraph of Darwin, that he brings at the very end, that he does a whole drush on Darwin. That he's basically like Rashi, Lehavdil, on Darwin. He takes every line and he expounds on Darwin. It's his Rebbe. Darwin's his Rebbe. But Darwin wrote in humility. Darwin was the one that wrote, there's grandeur in this vision of life, and Darwin was humbled, very humbled, by what it was that he discovered.
In those days, he had to be humble, didn't he?
He did, but Darwin, as far as what we know, about Darwin, he didn't throw God out.
Excellent.
Yeah, he didn't throw God out. He left it where he didn't know,
Excellent.
and that's a level of humility. Dawkins, I don't want to speak about his character. I mean, we're here to talk about the book and what it means and its implications for us. But Dawkins, he's essentially moved to a place or a space in where he refuses any opening whatsoever to the doubt of a deity, even if it might be a different deity than he's thrown out. That's my claim, about our modern atheists. I have a soft spot in my heart for them, and perhaps I shouldn't as a rabbi, but I do. And the reason why I do is because they are essentially throwing out a theology that didn't work. It didn't work. And for much of its history was extremely abusive and manipulative to its adherents, almost in a sense of child abuse, and where we're exploiting the ignorance. I mean, especially if we go back to the ages in where you couldn't write if you weren't part of the church, you couldn't produce art if you weren't part of the church, you couldn't read, and so on and so forth. And so I think that many of our modern atheists are emerging, almost as though emerging from a cult, from this. And what they're throwing out is, perhaps some might see the baby with the bathwater, or God with the bathwater, whatever it is, but they're not yet open to experience what it is that God might be. I mean, I found this in his presentation of the starlings. He's talking about local laws and how they end up emerging in these amazing patterns that show themselves to be planned or directed and conducted. And to me, it's beautiful, but depending on how it is that you understand God, it's not an impossibility by any means that this should be the way that the world emerges. But I suppose we'll leave that a bit for towards the end of the discussion. But I'm interested to know, do you look at the world differently as a result of reading this book?
I think you feel it's much more complicated. One sort of sails through life with a minimum of information, and I think that this opens up a new chapter as far as information is concerned, for sure.
And the world's and the structure.
Well, I must say, I think one thing that is special about Dawkins, love him or hate him, is that certainly when he's writing, you can tell he's a lecturer, because he won't allow himself to glide over any new thing he's introducing without stopping and explaining. We get a whole chapter in here about plate tectonics.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's,
Judy doesn't agree. I have a couple.
I'll probably skip that chapter.
Right. Well, I mean, I read it the second time around. I cut through the whole geologic time thing. I mean, he went. I just couldn't get. But that's what he tries to do. I mean, he just tries because he doesn't want to leave any.
But then you're woken up every now and then by one of his little rants.
Yeah.
One of his little bits of nastiness. Because actually,
It's interspersed, isn't it? But it's
he's so.
predominant.
I mean, you think you can have a discussion. He just says they are worse than ignorant. They are deluded to the point of perversity.
But when does he say that?
When after the sunflowers, and
He
was
says
talking about
that.
all that.
He says that about the relationship or how people feel about time and the earth. And he
Yeah.
says, if you think that the world could have gotten where it is
Yeah.
in 10,000 years, they're worse than ignorant. I think that's
Yes.
when it is. So it's not nice to say that to anybody. But again, imagine if you were speaking to someone. You know, I don't love that he used the Holocaust, you know, at the beginning of the book, you know, as the example. But it didn't upset me. I just thought that, you know, interesting that was the example that he used. But if you see something so clearly, and the evidence is so abundant, and people refuse with absolutely closed eyes, stomping their feet, in no way allow for themselves to hear or see it in any way, and to boot, attack you for the things that you are saying that you, I don't are so horribly violent personally, but I, you know.
No, I think you're right, because he later says that he's so disturbed by the American statistics about the number of people who believe in creationism. He said, I should be able to leave this aside, but I can't leave it aside because of the influence that these people have in America and in
Yeah.
schools and
That's
what
the
they're
thing.
teaching children.
I think
and
that's
he
the key.
could be a vice president and still believe this. And
But I
that-
think that's the
that
most
is a good
frightening
point.
thing that comes
Yes.
out of the book, that how human beings can believe that black is white and white
Yes.
is black. And I recall Buzz Aldrin, who was the second guy to go onto the moon, and he kept coming across people who said, oh, well, it all was a Hollywood film and the rest of it. Now, can you imagine how you feel when you've trained to that level, and you've been the second person of 12 people to go on the moon, and somebody's standing in front of you and saying you never did it?
Yeah, it's just
Well, I can only assume that, in a sense, that's the frustration he also feels,
Precisely.
when people are saying black is white and white is black.
yeah. But
And
to
that's
realize,
frightening that people can
But-
oh, it's terribly frightening.
But at the same time, he doesn't allow God into the picture at any point.
Right.
So, okay, the Earth is 3 billion years old or whatever it is, and it's scientifically proven now, etc., etc. But I, for one, still have this nagging doubt. Okay, it wasn't 5,700 years ago, but how did it all start? How did this
But it's
single
not-
cell?
It's not really relevant though for this book, though, is it? Is it relevant for this topic? Maybe.
Well, I think it is
It
very
is very
relevant,
relevant,
and I think if you
because
go
that's
into
his whole-
astronomical world, it becomes even more relevant, because you just can't get your head around it.
Because, I mean, what is interesting is that, for me, I've never seen the conflict between the two. Do we want to start with a literal interpretation? Okay, Vaishbot Vayomashvi doesn't mean that it stopped. It just took it just stopped for a minute. In other words, it wasn't all done. It continued. And also, as I'm afraid I'm quoting a TV serial, and it's the West Wing, so it's not that. Faith is evidence of things not seen. And therefore, ultimately, when you go back and keep going back, what started it? You go back to the creation, but not in the creationism way. I've never seen that conflict. What I found interesting in this book is how I was actually seeing it, going through it with the mindset of somebody who actually never saw the conflict, but has been frustrated because I have nephew who have taken children out of some school because of what they were taught in the creationism side, or even things like the intelligent design, which is even worse in my opinion.
It's a problem, intelligence. I want to get into the God question in a minute, but you know, beyond the question of the fright, you know, I think it's fright, not fear, of knowing that people could literally see black as white. It's the fact that we need scientists. We need children to know science. It's important. We need children to be able to come onto reality, and that's a difficult issue. And ironically, in a world that allows for the scientist like Richard Dawkins to be as vocal as he is, you know, on atheism, in an open, liberal world that allows for viewpoints to be able to come out, it's the same world that allows for people to remain ignorant and to allow for people, masses of people, to accept falsehoods as reality without the concern that what will ultimately end up be created in the future is a generation of adults that do not progress in terms of our scientific understanding of the way that the world functions. And that plays on almost every area of science. I mean, I don't think there's almost an area of science in this book that he didn't touch on and show its relationship to the fundamental understanding of evolution and how it affects everything else. So that's, I mean, it's one thing to feel like, you've done all this work and nobody's listening. It's another thing to realize, but this is reality in the best possible way that we know it, and people refuse to acknowledge.
Civilization, but let's say 10,000 years ago, beginning of civilization, well, science is essentially Western science is a product of the century.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about 250 years in maybe 5,000, maybe 10,000. So that's like, the last 24-hour day or the last hour in a 48-hour weekend. So it's not that there are many people who culturally, simply don't have the same notions, evidence and truth.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful story a Israeli friend of mine told me about a TV program where the program maker was interviewing a woman in Gaza, and she was complaining about how the wicked Israelis were starving them, and she said, "It's really terrible. There's no bread in Gaza. There is no bread in Gaza." And the interviewer said, and you could see it on the shot, said, "Just behind you there is a man with a large barrow which is absolutely piled with loads of bread."
Oh.
And she turned round, she said, "But there's no onions." And, I mean, it sounds like a joke, but it's not, because she wasn't being dishonest.
Right.
She wasn't saying to herself, "I know there's bread, but I'll tell this man there's no bread." In some sense, she thought there was no bread. And it's a deep, deep cultural thing.
It is.
And the modern scientific.
Like
There's
America.
a veneer, I should say.
But going back in time, there were cultures, one thinks of Greece, who were curious, who were putting a lot of effort into trying to work things out. And so there always has been that aspect of humanity, of some people being very curious.
China, look at China, before the Greeks. So it's a little bit more than the 200 years, but I think it's a lot of the blinkered approach and the refusal to accept the science is down to some of the religions.
Yes. Yes. See, when you tamper with a person's God, you're playing with fire. I mean, you are. It's just, when you tamper with a person's God, you're playing with fire, and that is an added ingredient to the question of which once more. Smalla. That's an added problem to just the question of curiosity, or the capacity to accept thought. Because if you think about, something as simple and evident to us as a heliocentric system, right, where you've got the sun at the center, and then, how long did it take us just to be able to deal with that reality? And that Copernicus should have been persecuted, Galileo was thrown, died, destined. The man was just completely destroyed by simply suggesting, you know what, it just all turns out a bit simpler if we put the sun at the center and not us at the center. So for people, and they saw that as an attack. Still till today, our prayers on Saturday morning talk about the sun coming out from the east, and we're going to, we do that in figurative sense, but it wasn't written in figurative sense. It was written believing that indeed that's what's going on. And so when we have to deal with shattering foundational, fundamental beliefs, right, and which is why we call people fundamentalists, because they don't really ever emerge beyond the fundamental vision of how it is that the world functions, and so it ends up being very black and white.
I think it's also the difference between not quite sure. I'm okay. Science and religion, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
In that science you can't just say something with science. Science requires the other half of science is one, an idea, and two, a proof.
Mm.
And you know, if you haven't got a science background, or you're not used to the concept of science, then you've got a problem.
Yeah.
You have got a problem, and you know, everyone is entitled to their own thought, and if they don't want to accept the idea of proof, well, that's fine, but that explains why a lot of people think they do or don't think that
But
they do.
the sad thing is that science is the one area of endeavour, human endeavour, that crosses all political boundaries, all nationalities. You know, it's and that's quite uplifting. I mean, that's one of the key elements, I think, that attracts me to science. That it, in fact, is a sort of a massive intellectual endeavour that
You've only
bridges
got to look at
all parts of the world.
the
You know.
Large Hadron Collider, you
Yes,
know, with people
yes,
from all
yes.
over
Yeah.
the world, you know,
And the
it's
other
wonderful.
sad thing is that most people go through life and they have no conception at all of the amazing physical system they're part of.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely mind-blowing. It's spectacular in
It
every
is.
sense of the word. And it always
It's the
struck me
greatest
as
show on
tragic.
earth.
Yes.
It is tragic that people are unaware of it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and
But then I
The
think it goes back
tragedy
to
to me, sorry.
I was
Yeah.
going to say it goes back to what you were saying, that
Mhm.
it's very important for people to sort of be interested in science.
Mm. The tragedy to me is that people don't allow themselves to be aware of it. It's not just that they're lazy and they don't do it. That's one thing. People may not, endeavor towards it. But the tragedy to me is that people will not allow themselves the openness to be able to experience it. And this, it brings me to the other question I wanted to put out. And that is, for me, the frustration, very different, obviously, than Dawkins. My frustration, personally, as a rabbi, is that I can barely use evolution in my Torah because I'll be tarred and feathered or crucified or burnt alive as a result of even mentioning it. And already, it's been the case, but to me it's frustrating because it is such an immensely beautiful vision, much more than anything we've ever. Because to me, if you look at evolution, and we have to deal with, there are two major things that I've found in my discussions of it with religious people that they have issues with. One is the randomness. Right, so towards the end of the book, when he deals with the ugliness, or the gruesomeness, if you will, right, of the nature of nature, and where you can have, this wasp stinging, how it ends up, right, that whole thing. But we'll talk about it in a moment. But the fact that everything, the unity that this brings to our universe, to who we are, to what we are, the shared life and existence that we have with all things, if that doesn't enhance a person's Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, I don't know what does. And to be able to look at any animal, to be able to look at a leaf on a tree, and to be able to see yourself in that entity, to see that the one source of life flows through all these things in their development, that all of our earth essentially is looking for its way to exist, through all of its amazing race of achievement. To me, grandeur in that vision of life, absolutely. You don't get grander than that. To talk about creation with a capital C in those terms. The problem that I always face, and I'll open it up, but the problem that I always face is that there's a fundamental issue that people have, because when they read the creation story, especially if they read it, and I'll say this advisedly, I know that people will perceive it not politically correct, but I'll explain why. If they read it in a Christian sense rather than in a Jewish sense, They are reading it matter of fact. They are reading it, this statement of the world was put together. And the Jewish people never read it that way classically. Never. We never read the Talmud. We never read the Talmud as story, Bereshit, as word for word fact as to how it is that it occurred. All you have to do is open the Talmud, and you see very, very clearly that the expressions of creation are the deepest secrets, right? What it is that these words express to us, but we approach it and examine it almost as scientists, right, to be able to discover what the meaning of it is. Well, I went through, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I'll put this out and end. I went through 2 years of studying the parasha of Bereshit itself with a group. And we ended up spending, we did it on Shabbat mornings before Shacharit. And I don't get up in the morning willingly, but this one, for this I got up. And we spent a week per pasuk, per verse, basically. We started simply pointing out the inconsistencies of the story if we are reading it as prose. In other words, if we're reading it simply as this is what happened, the inconsistencies are so abundant and blatant. You can't get through it without realizing, wait a minute. Maybe we're approaching this with the wrong perspective. Maybe it's not simply a story of history. And the truth is, if you look at it, it's a layer. It goes back on itself several times in different perspectives. In different what do you call it? Camera focus.
Lenses.
No, what is it? No, not angles. Yeah, what do you call it? It's the word starts with an R. It's the tip of my tongue. I forget it. But in any case, we're looking at it on completely different levels. We're zooming in and focusing on details, right? So in the first story, we talk simply about macrocosm. We don't talk about any process. We talk simply about speaking and outcomes, and speaking and outcomes. And even in that macro process, God's looking at what's coming out. I mean, it's the craziest story in the world. If you're a technocrat God, right? If you're a mechanic God, and you're putting things together, why are you looking at what comes out and seeing if it's good or not? Why are you putting orders in somewhere, right, and waiting for them to come back at you? Why are you then peeling the story, the first layer of the story, and then going back to Adam and saying, well, what actually happened over there on that first day, and so on and so forth? It's a completely different approach. So, to look at it, and there was an influence of Christianity in terms of how it is that we learn to see things, especially in the West. And so to read the story that way, people believe that they're selling God short because he couldn't create the world in 6 days in the complexity that he did. But in reality, when you realize that we've been creating ourselves all the way, I guess we'll come back to it, because it's an important point. It's a much more beautiful vision. But what did it do? I mean, if anything, in terms of your understanding of creation and reading this book? I probably imagine that the level of dissonance was low around this table, but what were your responses in terms of your knowledge of creation, which you came to it with in terms of how you felt about creation, if you feel about creation anything, and after?
I was just staggered by who wrote about the flowers. I mean, it was the most beautiful chapter, and that's probably as far as I go in the book. But it never occurred to me that flowers do what they do. I mean, I learned it in biology, but not to that extent. It was the most phenomenally beautifully descriptive imagery.
Back to creation, reading this book. Did it adjust, did it change? It came in and said, yes, more, it just reinforces.
I think there's a problem going on, you said, about science having facts requiring proof. This is in direct confrontation with religious belief.
How so?
Belief, you've got to have faith, and you've got to believe in something you don't know. And when you're arguing with somebody who is maybe a not believer, it's very difficult because you always end up saying, well, I just believe this. And the other person will say, but you've got no reason to believe this. You know, what is the proof behind it?
Yeah.
And that was one thing. The thing that sort of disturbs me quite a bit when you're talking about the creation story and the double stories and the repetitions and the slightly different story of Noah and all this kind of thing. That leads to different thoughts. But something I want to ask you, maybe a very difficult thing to ask you is, if as a rabbi you can say, this is a story, this is, you know, we have to interpret it as we do, how does that sit with the Talmudic approach of analysing every single word, and every word is important? And I'd really like you to explain that, if you can. If that
I'll comment on two things that you said, that and the previous thing. I mean, I feel that it's important to make a differentiation between religion and God. I really do. I think that there's an important differentiation to be made, because religion, people can get sidetracked with religion. Because as it is in religion, people tend to forget about God. At least in my experience, you know. They just don't like, you know, God's a rough one to manage, but religion, because in religion we don't have to go back to proof. You could just, you know, it and, you know, you do it how you like. But God is not as much that. Yeah, I mean, granted, I'll grant those who feel that God needs to be believed in rather than known in terms of existence. But I do think that it makes a difference in terms of what you understand God to be. Because when you say G-O-D, what are you talking about? You know, we all just kind of accept that when we say that word, everybody's got the same thing in mind. And I'm not so sure that everybody's got the same thing in mind. That when Dawkins says God, and I say God, not sure that necessarily we're talking about the same entity. So I'll put that out there for, you know, to begin with. But in terms of analyzing every word, listen, the Talmudic ideal is not necessarily to analyze every word, but it is to look at language and to understand language. And to understand language, we have to be able to look at words within context, within compared context, and be able to understand their meaning through that. That's essentially the endeavor of the Talmud. I mean, on a certain level, you could say that the rhetoric of the Talmud is essentially to explore our language and what we mean by what we say. So as far as the creation story is concerned, it's not that we're looking at picking apart every word. It's that we're looking at it and saying, listen, this is packed. It's a packed literature. Yeah, it's not to be read as, you know, I don't know if you have them here, we call little golden books. You know, the little golden books, right? You know, it's children's books. It's a series of children. You know, you had a little golden library, and they were called little golden books because on the back they were, you know, they had little gold color on it. But, you know, when you talk about a little golden book, it's a child's book. It's a children's book. You know, what we're saying and what the Talmud would say is we don't read the story as though it's a children's story. We read the story as though it's a sophisticated, it can be read by a child as a fairy tale and appreciated in that sense. But even as fairy tales, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying that the Torah's story of creation, at least in my mind, is a fairy tale. I believe that has implications to it. It uses terms for things that are otherwise esoteric, presenting. I look at it and much in the way that I would do with literature, if I really wanted to understand what the author was trying to tell me, not in a postmodern way and where it could be anything, right? I'm saying, what was the author trying to put forth, right? That's more or less what it is that we're doing. Yeah, and if we could say, well, then why didn't he just come out and say it? Well, that's what poetry is for, you know.
And that's very different from science.
It is. It is.
You know, one is like analysing Shakespeare, if you like, and one is trying to explain with proofs, and until you've got a proof that stands up, until another theory comes up, and the other proof can be knocked out. Science moves forward,
But it doesn't necessarily have to be divorced from science. It's simply looking at things in a different perspective. It doesn't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive of scientific discovery.
Well, I mean, science is just trying to understand the material world.
Yeah.
But
But-
look
but-
at, sorry.
So, but as human beings, we're looking to find meaning in
Yes.
life. And that's where, of course, religion makes its contribution.
Yeah. What science might say to that is, well, I mean, is there any pivoting with your meaning? In other words, do you have any grounding with our search for meaning? Is it just what makes us feel comfortable? Or is there some rootedness to the things that we find meaningful or the nature of meaning that we discover?
Is it possible that the word meaning is the wrong M word? And the word we ought to be talking about is morality, because whatever science may say, you're left with a fundamental human question which goes back at least to Aristotle, if not further, which is how should you live?
How you live your life.
And how should you live your life? And although science may provide, I suppose, some sort of backdrop against which your choices must make some kind of sense, and so it wouldn't make any sense to say the thing to do is to become king of the world and kill everybody else and you kill it for yourself, because scientists will point out to you that's not going to work out very well if you do it. But that's a separation. The trouble with the meaning word is that it invites you to find a kind of contrary version of science, and that's
I
setting up a conflict.
I don't think that. I think that they're quite separate. I really think. I mean, science is just trying to explain the physical world.
Yes.
It doesn't tell you how to live your life.
No, indeed.
It doesn't even attempt to do that.
No. I'm agreeing with you completely.
Yeah.
The morality. I'm saying the word meaning. I'm suggesting it's better to think about morality as the challenge rather than meaning, because meaning invites you to ask questions like, why are we here? Who put us here? Why did the being that put us here, and what does the being that put us here expect from us? And you're back in the religious conflict with science, because Dawkins would say, nobody put you here. You're here because of the workings of these processes down long periods of time. But that leaves untouched the question of how you should live your life.
Yes, I mean, I don't see the two in conflict in a sense, because the reality of you being here, then you have the question of how do I live my life?
Yes, indeed. No, of course.
But my question always has been divorced. Are those not connected? In other words, the reality of my being here, it's almost as though I have to pick up from a nowhere. Because if I'm here, I don't find implications on the nature of my existence as to how I should live. In other words, the way to put it is, if I don't find even my morality, I mean, I have an issue with asserting either meaning or I should live my life in arbitrary means or in arbitrary forms. Should morality not, even morality, be connected to existential questions? In other words, talk about good and evil. Essentially is the question of morality. Should my definition of good not be rooted in consensus to what is viable and isn't viable? What works in this world and what doesn't, in whatever capacity I know that it can? Should evil not be related in some capacity to what I know will not work, is not functional, doesn't support and cultivate life and existence? Yes? And if that's the case, to the nature of being, even my questions on morality are connected to the nature of being. See, again, I mean, it's no secret to anybody that I'm a student of Maimonides. And Maimonides holds very, very strongly, very powerfully, that we discover God through the world because it's his art. In other words, it's what he put out. Because if I can't, I mean, we actually get that from last week's parasha, because if I can't ascertain God directly in terms of his existence itself. The only thing I've got is what he puts out. Yeah. So in the same way, in perhaps a crude sense, that I have an artist that is no longer alive, will never be able to shake hands with that individual, meet that individual, speak to that individual, and hear back from that individual. What I've got is what they've put out into this world. And I, on a certain level, can say that I know Rembrandt. I know the man. I know him from studying everything that he's put out into this world. I know Mozart. And I like him, whatever. And it may be that I have loved his character, but I know what came out of that man. So in a certain sense, we could say about God, I know what came out, and I know him through what it is that he put out. And that's what Maimonides might advocate. Not that everybody has to agree, but it's what he would put out and say, you know something, that's what makes our people unique, perhaps, or it's the unique perspective of our people in terms of how it is that we experience God. And so that when I'm reading science, I'm reading of the works. I'm coming to understand. And it's true that science stops there. It simply tells you the work. This is the technical nature of the work. What does that say to you in terms of reading? That's why my opening question was, because it's my experience. When I read this, I'm overcome. You read about the flowers and the birds and their connections and their interactions and how they developed in terms of, and you realize I'm part of all of this. And this tells me something, not just about the world that I live in, but about my own existence, and ultimately about existence itself, about the nature of being itself. It tells you something. And if we can map it out completely, no, but the experience that we get from recognizing that is extremely impactful. And to us, that's all that we really mean when we say God. We're trying to come on some terms to interact and experience existence itself. So the issue that Dawkins puts out, and he really hangs his atheist hat on this key issue, and it's throughout all of his writings, and it's really throughout most of the writings of the modern atheists today. And perhaps with this I'll open it up and hear, how people feel about it, because it's very intriguing to me. And with this, I guess we'll end our discussion, is the randomness. That's where he keeps going back to saying, well, really, what kind of God would step back and allow for these kinds of things to progress? It's a classic question of evil, the existence of evil allows it, but it's one thing to say, Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, which we would never say. We don't chalk off. To have a world in where blindly these things are going on to the caterpillar, or to the worm and the wasp, or what have you, how do you reconcile God with it? And I'm interested to hear everyone. I think that if you simply as willing being, powering being, wishing for anything that can exist to exist, and to allow the space for those things to be able to find their existence in all of the chaotic, crazy developments and process. It's upsetting perhaps to watch them. What it does retain is the immense value of self-creation and self-organization, of becoming oneself. And on a certain level, it's something that we all wish for ourselves. We want to be made by another. We want to be the champions of our own lives. And what that requires is a certain level of freedom. And I believe it's one of the reasons why people will not opt for freedom most of the time, because it's a scary process. And the realities of ugly pitfalls are right there. But what are your thoughts about the question of randomness, which is clearly part of our world, and the question of God? Do you throw up your connection to God on that problem?
Just raise a point, is that one must presumably distinguish between the individual member of the species and the species as a whole, or a group of the species at a particular time. And if you're a gazelle, it may be very little consolation to know that as a species you can run very fast because there are these cheetahs around.
Right.
But actually, I personally, as gazelle number 1876439, I've just felt this cheetah jump on my back in these curtains.
Yes.
And that's, there's a dissonance there between the fate of the species and the fate of the individual. And in religion, broadly speaking, we're inclined to a person, a religion that is in some sense personal, and it's about the individual. But evolution really isn't about the individual, it's about individuals in various aggregations and groups.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting because at least Dawkins would say that he argued with this entire idea because evolutionary biologists had difference of opinion as to what was the moving factor of evolution. Is it indeed the group, right, or the species that's moving it forward, or is it something else? And Dawkins' groundbreaking assertion, which today is pretty much accepted, in terms of how it functions, is that it's the gene. It's the gene, the self gene. And I'll tell you, I mean, I learned so much about human nature from that book, and where on a certain level you can look at yourself and everything around, and he touches on it here, as a gene machine. You're a gene machine. And when you know yourself as that, it changes your entire perception of yourself. And what he writes is that, in this particular format of gene machine that we call human, which incidentally happens to have the most complex structure in the known universe by many orders of magnitude, called the human brain, which allows for consciousness, and metacognition, which is the capacity to think about what you think about and know about the fact that you know about whatever it is that you know about. You liberate yourself from the drive of the gene needing to survive, and then you can look at yourself as either gene machine or as me. And that conflicts, right? It's a direct opposition with each other, because what I want for me is not necessarily what the gene machine wants for itself. Yeah. And this becomes, when you see the classic discussion in Talmud or in Torah of Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Ra, right? Or evil and good inclination. So when you see it in these terms, and you can realize, wait a minute, these things have been running in me for 4.6 billion years running. I mean, if you go back to the beginning, it's a formidable task. They've been around much longer than I have. So, but it's an amazing thing. So it's true that the species is a question when you're looking at randomness and how species will ultimately fare, but ultimately it's a question of how genes will ultimately fare and how they will end up expressing themselves in various species. The question is the fact that it is random. I can't stress enough how serious of a problem this is for religious people.
It's a terrible problem.
Yeah.
Because just take Yom Kippur, for example.
Yeah.
We're all standing there and we're trying to pray all day, and we're saying, if we do the right thing, then we'll be written in the book of life. And we're really, really, really trying. But if it's completely random, you get knocked down by a bus the next day.
You know what the amazing thing is, Judy? Do you know how much randomness is part of Yom Kippur? It's all of Yom Kippur. Because you don't have Yom Kippur unless you have randomness. You need the openness of chance to get a chance to be able to live your life, which is why the central element of Yom Kippur in the Mikdash was a lottery. Yeah, it's a lottery. It's a lottery. I determine what animal goes where, in those terms. What's the Azazel and what is La Hashem? By a lot. And not only that, every story, I think I wrote about this Kippur and the thing, but the Jonah story, right? How do they figure out who's who, and right? It's all lots. But how do they figure out who to throw overboard? It's all lots. And where do they throw them? Into the vast sea, where it's all...
But how does this tie up with what we're supposed to be trying to do if you feel that human endeavour is, to some extent, if you're feeling depressed, you could think, where are we going? We're trying really hard, and yet the whole thing is random.
So here's the thing. The amazing thing about evolution is that things are selected for that are viable. There's one question that Dawkins never entertains. I haven't seen any evolutionary biologist entertain this question. They all talk about survival of the fittest. And they talk about the selection of DNA, which essentially is memory. It's just memory. You're remembering what works and keeping it in gen and producing it forward. Nobody entertains what the external environment is that makes viable over. In other words, there is something about the nature of being that either allows for something, for lack of a better term, to be or not. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, whatever it is in our environment that works as opposed to doesn't work. Right? There's an environment within which it's embedded that makes it work or not work. I don't mean make it mechanically. I mean, it's because of the circumstances of the nature of reality that this thing ends up functioning and the other doesn't.
But the environment includes the competition with other species.
I'm not talking about the internal environment. I'm talking about the external environment. I'm talking about the environment within which it's embedded, if you will. Right? I'm talking about what is it about the external environment that allows for something to be functional, viable, or not viable. We look at it from the inside, and we say, oh, that's viable, so that worked. That's not viable, so it didn't work. Oh, well, why is that viable? Oh, well, that's because it had these properties and it worked. But my question is deeper than that. My question goes beyond that. My question is, why is it that those properties are the ones that end up... Essentially, the question is, there is something that impacts what exists and what doesn't exist. Yes? There's something that... we call that existence with a capital E, or God, if you will, right? I mean, there's an external, primary existence, primal existence, that is the makom. That's why in Hebrew we call it makom, the ultimate place of all things, within which all things occur and are embedded. And so given that, anything that can exist will exist, if it has the properties to exist. So why am I bringing this up? Because your question is, if it's all completely random, it's depressing, and who knows if we have anything. But recognize that there are things that are selected for. There is something that determines, not in a mechanistic way, by simply being, that determines what works and what doesn't work, what will end up being and what doesn't end up being. We believe in Israel that Torah guides us from existence, saying to us, these things will help you achieve that, these things will not. And if I miss the mark on whatever it is, Kippur gives me the opportunity in all of the randomness of life to be able to reset or to adjust or to move and try this way instead of the other way and move forward. But there is something out there that determines ultimately what is and what isn't, if you will.
Just talking about a moral code?
No, I'm talking about much more than a moral code. A moral code is internal and local. I'm talking about an existential reality from which a moral code should emerge.
Which something Dawkins doesn't believe.
Doesn't touch. Well, he doesn't touch it as a scientist, and that we would forgive him for because he's a scientist. It's not something he's supposed to touch. But to because you don't touch it, that's a whole other question. That's what he does.
He rejects it.
He rejects it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is there anywhere in his writings does he ask or does he say where the original cell or the original gene or the original anything in our universe came from?
He knows that. I mean, he doesn't. Nobody knows.
Talking about living.
Yeah. Nobody knows how the first living.
The universe.
Are you sorry? Yeah, but are we talking?
Big Bang.
Oh, you're talking about the universe
No,
itself.
you-
No, you can't. As a scientist, you can't entertain that question because your discipline begins once things are. You can't talk about things before that. Yeah.
So if his disciplines start, or their disciplines start when things are,
Yes.
how did things become are?
Well, that's not.
You can't. We
Dawkins.
can't ask
That's
that.
not- it's
A
not
scientist can't ask that question.
That's what I meant.
Scientists
No.
can't.
A scientist will never ask that question because it's not falsifiable. You can't.
But it doesn't stop him from saying things like,
Yeah.
I highlighted this, there
Yeah.
is no overall plan of development, no blueprint, no architect's plan, no architect.
Of
He's
biological
right.
development.
He's right.
He's right, but what he precludes is any external, if you will, of the entire endeavor. He's correct that there's no conductor that's running through, builder that's saying, okay, I'm going to write up these plans. But he also precludes precursor. Precursor. I think that's a good word for it. There's no precursor. He says, and this is where he will not speak about it because this is not a logical thing to say. What he says is, no, there's no precursor. It's just an infinite regress. An infinite regress into what? Well, it's an infinite. Well, it's infinite by definition. And so if you say that it's an infinite regress, even though you recognize that primal existence must be infinite by definition, right? Couldn't be not infinite, because if it's primal, it's not contained in anything in any way, and therefore, right? But if you realize, if you say that, you say, okay, well then, if it's an infinite regress, then it's not existence itself, right? Nothing really exists. You don't have anything drawing and actually in any way. It's all virtual and so on and so forth, which is fine, whatever it is. My point is much simpler. My point simply is that there is something external to all of this that must determine what is viable and what isn't. And when I say that, I'm borrowing the terms because when we hear that, we think that there's this overt determination. This will be, this won't be. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying simply by way of its being. Certain things within it that are growing within it will work and won't work, based on being embedded within. And so when we realize that it's the same thing with our own lives. There are certain things that work, and there are certain things that don't. We don't always know what they are. The way the world got to where it is now, and this beautiful book that Dawkins wrote, was trial and error. But the beautiful thing, I always use this analogy, I use this on Shabbat, but this analogy kind of helps. It's not a bunch of monkeys typing on typewriters blindly. It's a bunch of monkeys typing on word processors that are looking for something, so to speak. In other words, there are certain things that are viable, there are certain things that aren't viable. The things that are viable are immediately selected for. And those stick. And they build on each other. And that's why his evidence is beautiful, because you could see, even in terms of the domestication and how domestication ends up working and so on, things that are viable stick and hold, and they continue forward. So if you had a bunch of monkeys typing on a word processor that was looking for a particular sentence, if you will, in the analogy, right? I am Joe. They could be typing crazy. You can be spilling things all over the place. They type in I with a capital, right? It's selected for immediately. And so too all of the rest of the Zens, until it actually ends up fine. It doesn't take a huge amount of time for that to end up happening, but it also adds meaning, right? And when I say meaning, I don't mean because we need the meaning because there's an external definition ultimately of what is and what isn't. So the randomness is essential, because without the randomness, we don't have the room for the trial and error, for the mistakes made, for the capacity to create ourselves and achieve our own lives. It would be, forgive me for the word, rape otherwise. Our existence would be imposed upon us. We would be created entirely at will, having no value of our own being. And we'd be completely abused, essentially, by the Creator, saying, you be, and this is how I've made you, and I'm putting you in like some type of remote control, which is how many religious people see the world. And the beautiful thing, we've never seen the world this way. It's be. And there you go. No, it's going to be a rough ride, but it's all yours. Yeah? And what ends up coming out comes out. So to randomness is an important part. A really, really, really important. And the amazing thing, it runs throughout all of Torah. Throughout all of Torah, all of Talmud, everywhere. It's all over the place. It's a major part of our understanding of the way that God runs the world, if for nothing else, Purim. The festival's called randomness. That's the name of the festival. Yeah.
The thing is, one thing I wanted to ask you is, there are sort of two levels of randomness. Sometimes randomness is attributed to things that are just too complex for us to see or predict or understand, so they will appear random. And I think in science very often that's the case, right? If you have too many interacting pieces, you sort of approximate them as acting randomly, and that's very often a very good approximation. But then there is also true randomness in science as well, I think, when things become truly chaotic. But what I mean is, there's randomness where it's just our interface or understanding of reality is limited, so it appears random. But in the grand scheme of things, it might not actually be random.
Very much so. In other words, when you look, but perhaps what you're referring to is emergence. In other words, where you look at something in the grand scheme and you see that there's this arc that we're kind of looking at in a very local way. But it's only if we see the perspective of perhaps even hundreds of years of development that we end up seeing this massive arc. And he talks about that with regards to the emergence of entities, right? In other words, the emergence of entities in evolution. If we're going to look at, it's like the silly question that people will ask an evolutionary biologist, how come I'm not changing? Or how come we're not seeing? Okay, if you want to deal with geologic time, and you see how things, but that's why he has the few chapters on, on domestication and so on and so forth. But it's true that through what we will see as random processes, nonetheless, things end up emerging, unless I'm not understanding your point on it, and then we would need to talk about an example.
I mean, I guess an example I think he mentions is a dice, right? You
Yeah.
throw a dice,
Mm-hmm.
it appears to us completely random. One of the 6 faces will land. However, if you had a slow motion video recording of that and you threw it in a specific way, you could predict how it will land, presumably. Or if you knew how to throw it and model it perfectly, you could predict the bounces and know how it'll land.
You could, but we don't. And so that opens it up, right? The fact that because of certain things it ended up falling that way doesn't preclude the fact that it was random in that it ended up falling out that way. Yeah? Right? And that's important. It's true that given particular genes functioning in a particular fashion, certain things are going to emerge, properties are going to emerge in terms of what it is that they express. Of course. But the fact that they end up doing it in the way that they do it is completely random. Right?
I think an example was when he had the example of the bacteria, and he had the several flasks.
How fantastic. Did you read that when you were inspired? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Just
Yeah,
unbelievable.
that was
the
very
outcome,
statistical.
the outcome of all of the flasks was that they did improve
The 12 tribes.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So they did improve the uptake of the glucose.
Mm.
But the route in which they got there was different.
Mhm.
The mutation that happened at each stage was a random
Yeah.
act, but the outcome was somehow maybe not so random.
It was a brilliant experiment, wasn't it? Brilliantly
Brilliant.
tried.
Yeah.
And he never fails to tell
Yeah.
you several times in the middle of that.
That's
Because he's bowled
that's
over.
extreme.
Yeah, yeah,
You
it's
know,
unbelievable.
As a scientist, he loves something that's,
Yeah.
so well thought through.
It is.
But actually,
And works
that's
so
a really
well.
good example of something random that then becomes viable,
yes,
right?
yes,
It's
yes,
completely
precisely.
random, but it's viable.
But somehow it ended up working.
Yeah.
My favorite example of this, and then we'll end with a brought to read that touches on this by our next author, right? And I thought that would be a nice bridge. But he speaks briefly, but not so much here, about convergent evolution, in where it's interesting, and to me, I realize that this, the model that I've put out, that evolutionary developments will find similar tactics, if you will, to address problems. So you have convergent evolution, and where, for example, in Australia, right, you have marsupial mammals and you have placental mammals, right? So placentals are placentas, and marsupials, they have pouches. They have no common development with each other, right? They went on completely different paths of developing, and yet their external properties are very much the same with each other. So you'll look at a dog. There's placental dogs, placental mice in Australia, and where their solution for carrying young was an external pouch, and where mice on another continent, right, was a placenta to be able to carry young in gestation. But the thing is that we look at the external properties and it's close enough to call it a mouse, because that's what we see, but it has no shared history whatsoever in terms of development. But what does happen is that it ends up using very similar properties to be able to get to it needs to get to, be able to navigate the world.
It does go back down the hairpin to the hairpin.
Sure, but my point is that you're deceived by the expressive qualities, by the external qualities. You look at a marsupial mouse and think that's a mouse. It's not a mouse. It's not. It has nothing to do with the. No, right? But yet, astonishingly, it ended up selecting for very similar properties. And to me, again, that tells me there's something about the nature of existence that works, that functions, and that we can say is defined by something external, and that's the way that we essentially look at God. But thank you for making the effort of reading it and coming together for discussion, because this is just it's wonderful. I'll pass this around. Take one, pass it around. And if you have a few moments, we'll read it out. So here, this is by Mark Helper, and he's our next. Passing him around, he's our next author, and we're going to be reading his. For those who want to opt in for the next discussion, a series of short stories called The Pacific. I hope that if you are interested, that you've already made efforts to try and get the book. Because I put that out there in the news because it's not so easy apparently. And in this book, there's this one page in where he talks about randomness and at the same time the nature of being. So I'll read it out for everyone. Unless anybody would like to volunteer. Anyone volunteer to read it? Michael, you want to read it? Yeah? Please, yeah.
The whole page?
Yeah, we'll read the whole page and we'll adjourn.
Nothing is random, nor will anything ever be, whether a long string of perfectly blue days that begin and end in golden dimness, the most seemingly chaotic political acts, the rise of a great city, the crystalline structure of a gem that has never seen the light, the distributions of fortune, what time the milkman gets up, the from, or the occurrence of one astonishing frigid winter after another. Even electrons, supposedly the paragons of unpredictability, are tame and obsequious little creatures that rush around at the speed of light, going precisely where they are supposed to go. They make faint whistling sounds that, when apprehended in varying combinations, are as pleasant as the wind flying through a forest, and they do exactly as they are told. Of this one is certain. And yet, there is a wonderful anarchy in that the milkman chooses when to arise. The rat picks the tunnel into which he will dive when the subway comes rushing down the track from Borough Hall, and will fall as it will. How can this be? If nothing is random and everything is predetermined, how can there be free will? The answer to that is simple. Nothing is predetermined. It is determined, or was determined, or will be determined. No matter, it all happened at once, in less than an instant. And time was invented because we cannot comprehend in one glance the enormous and detailed canvas that we have been given. So we track it in linear fashion, piece by piece. Time, however, can be easily overcome, not by chasing the light, but by standing back far enough to see it all at once. The universe is still and complete. Everything that ever was is. Everything that ever will be is. And so on, in all possible combinations. Though in conceiving it we imagine that it is in motion and unfinished, it is quite finished and quite astonishingly beautiful. In the end, or rather as things really are, any event, no matter how small, is intimately and sensibly tied to all others. All rivers run full to the sea. Those who are apart are brought together. The lost ones are redeemed. The dead come back to life. The perfectly blue days that have begun and ended in golden dimness continue immobile and accessible. And when all is perceived in such a way as to obviate time, justice becomes apparent, not as something that will be, but something that is.
It's a nice end.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So he's our next author. And
When are we going to do that?
I forget the date, but it's there. So we'll get it out. Anyway, thank you everyone. It's
Thank
really
you.
good fun and pleasure. Thank you.
If it's possible to have a list of further books, because it takes a while to find the book.
The question is our next book. I definitely can suggest, but I always said that I would open the fourth book to suggestions. So
Because it might take 3-4 days for the local bookshop to.
I understand. Yeah.
Here's an idea.
Yes.
What we could do, people who have an idea of a book they